Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Story 1. The House That Heard Everything. Owen Sterling was a man who specialized in valuing the unsellable. As a forensic appraiser, his job wasn't to count rooms, but to assign a numerical value to loss, decay, and occasionally pure dread. This led him, on a miserable October evening, to the outskirts of Willow Creek and to the infamous Blackwood Manor. The manor wasn't old, not truly. It was built in the early 1900s, a hulking monument of dark oak and slate, sitting too close to the road and too far from sanity. Its last resident, an eccentric recluse named Dr. Silas Holloway, had passed away 6 months prior, leaving the estate to a distant niece who promptly hired Owen to determine its salvage value. Owen parked his rental car and grabbed his heavy flashlight. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until they hum. As he stepped onto the porch, the heavy oak door didn't just creak, it groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a massive tree collapsing into soft earth. The interior was immaculate, preserved in a sepia-toned time capsule. Dust lay heavy and undisturbed, yet the air felt strangely filtered, the stillness unnatural. The moment Owen stepped inside, he noticed the peculiar acoustic quality of the house. Every sound he made, the rustle of his jacket, the click of his camera, the shallow inhalation of his breath, seemed to be absorbed and then subtly return. He began his appraisal in the parlor. Dr. Holloway had been a collector, but not of fine art or rare books. He collected sound. Every wall in the house was lined with glass jars, each sealed with wax and labeled in elegant, spidery script. Owen squinted at the labels under his flashlight beam. One jar read, "The Final Sigh of My Mother." Another, a burst of genuine laughter from the gardener, 1978. A third, chillingly vague, the sound of a promise being broken. It was absurd, a morbid eccentricity, yet the sheer volume of jars suggested a life dedicated to this bizarre pursuit. As Owen moved deeper into the house, the silence became oppressive. He reached the staircase, a sweeping curve of mahogany that ascended into blackness. Halfway up, he paused, noticing a faint, high-pitched whirring sound coming from the third floor. It sounded like a tape recorder playing at an impossibly low speed. He ascended to the main bedroom, the largest room in the house. Here the collection was at its densest, focusing on the sounds of human anguish and confusion. He found jars labeled "The Uncertainty of a First Lie," "The Tremor of Guilt," and "A Dream Ending Too Soon." He was beginning to feel profoundly unsettled. It wasn't the evidence of death, but the evidence of a life spent dissecting and hoarding the most fleeting human moments. As he moved a heavy velvet curtain, he heard it clearly for the first time. A faint, almost subliminal whisper right behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes. Nothing. Just the wind, he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the house was sealed tight. He continued his work, documenting the unusual collection. A chill settled in his bones, and he started working faster, anxious to leave. He took a photo of a mahogany desk piled high with ancient dictaphones and recording equipment. Then, from the corner of the room, he heard a sound so specific, so perfectly timed that his blood ran cold. It was the distinct, sharp click of his camera shutter, but it came after he had already taken the photo. It was the phantom echo of his own action. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt suddenly naked, exposed, like the walls themselves had eyes. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sounding thin and small in the echoing space. In response, he heard a new sound, not an echo, but a playback from one of the collection jars. It was a man's voice, raspy and choked with fear, shouting, "Who's there?" It was his own voice, recorded seconds ago. Owen dropped his camera and stumbled backward. This house didn't just have good acoustics, it was an active archive. It wasn't haunted by a dead spirit. It was haunted by its own continuous, live recordings of everyone who had ever been afraid within its walls. He looked around wildly. On a small, empty shelf near the door, a new glass jar sat, pristine and clean, awaiting its label. He needed to leave. He ran down the stairs, but with every step he took, the house played back a new sound. The panicked thump of his foot, the desperate gasp for air, the low, frustrated curse he muttered as he missed the last step. The sounds layered, growing louder, turning the stairwell into a cacophony of his own escalating panic. As he reached the bottom floor, he saw a flickering light in the kitchen. He approached cautiously, his heavy-duty flashlight beam shaking. In the center of the kitchen, sitting on a stainless steel operating table, was Dr. Holloway. But not quite Dr. Holloway. The figure was translucent, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt, yet he was meticulously sealing a new jar with deep crimson wax. The ghost raised his head, and his eyes, though hollow, seemed to focus on Owen. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The house spoke for him. 1,000 tiny noises, the scrape of a chair, the gentle patter of old rain, the soft hiss of gas escaping a valve, played simultaneously, creating a sound wave of pure psychological intrusion. Then, the translucent Dr. Holloway pointed a spectral bony finger at the label on the jar he had just sealed. Owen didn't want to read it, but his eyes were drawn in an irresistible, terrible fascination. The label read, "The sound of appraiser Sterling's definitive, debilitating terror, October 27th, 2025. Owen screamed. It was not a horror movie scream. It was a deep, primal, unburdened sound of utter self-preservation giving way to madness. It was, he instantly knew, the most perfect, raw sound the house had ever collected. He didn't remember opening the door or starting the car. He only remembered the sickening click of the lid sealing the jar in the kitchen as he tore down the driveway. Owen never looked back. The niece received his report 3 days later. Blackwood Manor, value 0. Reason: the structure is a sentient acoustic prison, and the cost of removal exceeds all material worth. He never told anyone what was on the label, but every night when the world around him went silent, he could still hear, just at the edge of his hearing, the faint, high-pitched whirring sound of a tape recorder, playing his definitive terror, waiting for the next listener. The house was closed, but the collection had opened, and he was now, and forever, a part of its archive.
Story 2: The House on the Tide. The coastal road that led to the tidal watch ended abruptly, swallowed by the marsh. The final stretch was a narrow gravel spit ending at a desolate concrete platform. And rising from the water on 20-foot concrete stilts was the house, a brutalist masterpiece of glass and sharp angles, looking less like a home and more like an observatory abandoned by a paranoid god. Cassidy had bought it sight unseen, a desperate act of subtraction. Her divorce was final, her life stripped down to the bone, and she wanted a place where the world couldn't reach her. The tidal watch promised isolation. It promised cold, clean modernity against the messy, ancient backdrop of the salt marsh. From the moment she arrived, the house felt less like a building and more like a massive skeletal insect waiting to crawl. The ground floor was just a hollow space where the tide surged and receded, leaving behind trails of phosphorescent green algae and the thick, suffocating smell of sulfur and brine. The isolation was immediate. The house hummed faintly with the sound of the wind whipping around the pilings and the relentless slosh hiss of the water below. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. On her first night, Cassidy found herself drawn to the massive, unsupported windows of the living room. The marsh stretched out, a black, velvet expanse, broken only by the thin silver ribbon of moonlight reflecting in the tidal pools. Below, beneath the house, the water was like black ink, deep and unknowable. She started seeing things in the deep, not concrete shapes, but impressions, brief flashes of luminescence, the slow, rhythmic disturbance of the water that suggested something immense was passing beneath the pilings. She told herself it was the current, or maybe the refracted light from a distant buoy. But the house was doing more than just isolating her. It was listening to the marsh. The low hum that permeated the structure was actually a collection of deep, resonant tones, a bass symphony played by the shifting silt and the unseen creatures of the abyss. As the tide rose, the sounds amplified, vibrating through the concrete and glass. Cassidy started hearing things in the sounds, a slow, sorrowful chant, the sound of heavy chains dragging across stone, and an occasional, thick, gurgling sigh that seemed to come from the very floor beneath her feet. The previous owner, a marine engineer named Arthur Merrick, no relation to the collector, designed the house to withstand hurricanes. He built it as a fortress against the elements, but he couldn't protect it from what lived in the elements. He vanished 6 months after moving in, leaving behind a single water-stained journal. Cassidy found the journal hidden beneath a floorboard in the master bedroom. It chronicled Arthur's descent. His early entries were triumphant. The structure sings with the tide, perfect fusion of man and nature. But the later entries were manic, scrawled in charcoal, the paper peeling from dampness. The water is the blood of the marsh, the stilts are the veins, and I am the heart. It wants me to join the circulation. I hear the old ones. They call it the hanging womb. It's the perfect incubator for the things that hate the light. I must reinforce the structure. They scratch at the pilings. The final entry was just a single terrified word repeated until the charcoal broke. Down, down, down. Cassidy slammed the journal shut. The water below the house suddenly looked less like a surface and more like a vast, pulsating membrane. That night, the house began to move. It was subtle at first, a small rhythmic sway like a ship at anchor. Cassidy rationalized it. High tide, strong currents, maybe a fault in the stilts. But the movement grew bolder. The whole structure began to lean imperceptibly toward the dark marsh. She noticed the changes in the glass. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows were no longer transparent. They were translucent, streaked with a pale, oily residue that looked like dried salt water mixed with something viscous and dark. She couldn't see the water anymore, but she could hear it clearer than ever before. The low, resonant chanting from beneath the house was now punctuated by a sickening, grinding sound. It was the sound of the concrete stilts being rubbed away. She raced to the reinforced door, expecting to escape onto the platform, but the door was locked. The smart house system, installed by Arthur Merrick, had locked her in. A display panel near the door flickered to life. The text was in Arthur Merrick's own panicked handwriting. Latching protocol active. The structure is now integrated with the tide. We must not disturb the sleepers. Wait for the low tide. Wait for the low tide. Wait. The screen dissolved into static. Cassidy pounded on the heavy glass, screaming. The house, in response, leaned further. From the hallway, she heard a sickening crack, like a large bone snapping. The main support beam of the western wing had fractured. Dust and concrete powder drifted into the air. She ran back to the living room, the center of the structure. The rhythmic swaying was now violent, pushing the house back and forth like a cradle. She saw it then, on the floor where the water stains met the clean tile, a thin, bubbling line of black sludge weeping up through the hairline fracture in the concrete. It smelled like rot and the bottom of the sea. The chanting below reached a fever pitch, an inhuman choir of deep-sea pressure and ancient, hungry voices. Cassidy looked out the window. Through the oily film, the tide was at its peak. And in the water, not swimming, but rising up toward the house, were the old ones that Arthur Merrick wrote about. They were massive, slow-moving forms, shaped vaguely like immense jellyfish with hundreds of long, snapping cilia. They glowed faintly, a sickly internal green light. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at the structure. One of the largest creatures rose high enough for its immense bulbous head to press against the reinforced glass of the floor. It wasn't trying to break in. It was simply clinging to its dinner. The grinding noise stopped. Silence. Then the house groaned, a final structural sigh of resignation. The air vent in the ceiling above Cassidy opened, and a thick torrent of black salt water, smelling intensely of sulfur, poured down, instantly soaking her. The water was cold, impossibly cold, and it carried the deep, resonant echoes of the things below. She tasted the brine, and with it, the truth. The house wasn't built on the marsh. It was built for it. It was a lure, a cage, designed to filter out the undesirables and keep the pure, raw fear inside, seasoning the sacrifice. Cassidy stood paralyzed as the black water reached her ankles, then her knees. She was sinking into the floor, not because the floor was broken, but because the house was letting the ocean in. She was no longer standing on a structure. She was standing in a tomb that was rapidly filling with the primordial ooze. The last sound Cassidy heard wasn't a scream, but a quiet, relieved gurgle from the marsh, accepting its newest and most terrified tenant. The tidal watch stood tall on its stilts, having finished its job, waiting for the next person, desperate enough to seek true isolation.
Story 3. The Clock That Only Ran Backward. Jasper Reed didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in temporal anomalies. As a paranormal investigator specializing in time leakage, he saw a haunted house as a glitch in the space-time continuum. This clinical approach led him to the oldest structure in Salem, Massachusetts, the Ashworth Homestead, locally known as the Chronometer House. The house was infamous for two things: the tragic, fiery death of the Ashworth family in 1904 and its impossible collection of clocks, 267 in total. Jasper arrived at midnight, the only time the house was said to be truly active. As he crossed the threshold, a wave of palpable heat hit him, followed instantly by the deafening sound of 267 clocks, all slightly out of sync, ticking in frantic chaos. He set up his gear, including a specialized device he called the Chronon Counter, designed to measure fluctuations in the local flow of time. It immediately started screaming, displaying erratic jumps from positive, time flowing faster, to negative, time slowing down. Ignoring the chaos, Jasper focused on the clock. He noticed a pattern that defied physics. None of them were running forward. The hands of every single clock in the house were moving in reverse. Some spun fast, blurring into a bronze haze. Others moved with a slow, agonizing crawl. All of them were perpetually rewinding the same moment. The grandfather clock near the fireplace, for instance, cycled endlessly between 1:15 a.m. and 1:17 a.m. The tragedy was simple. In the early morning of October 31st, 1904, the clock in the master bedroom stopped at 1:18 a.m. Seconds later, a house fire consumed the family. Local legend claimed the fire was merely a cover-up for something deeper. Jasper ascended to the master bedroom, the cold heart of the anomaly. The temperature here was glacial. In the center of the room, on a scorched mantelpiece, sat the original clock, a small, ornate brass timepiece with a fractured face. Its hands were locked precisely at 1:18 a.m. As Jasper stepped closer, the chaotic ticking of the other clocks seemed to organize itself, forming a single, deafening unison. The sound morphed into a deep, low thrumming, like the sound of a massive spring being wound backward under impossible tension. It was the sound of a moment being held captive. Jasper looked at his chronon counter. The display had stabilized, showing a single terrifying number,
minus 1.0 seconds per second. Time in this room was flowing perfectly backward at the exact same rate as forward, but only for a specific tight loop. He realized the horror wasn't a ghost, it was the event itself. The terror, the fire, the deaths, it wasn't a memory. It was a phenomenon perpetually unhappening, forcing the family to relive the final moments of panic over and over. As the chronon counter held steady at minus 1.0 seconds, the room cycled toward the tragedy's starting point. The dust rose from the floor, coalesced, and settled back down in reverse. Soot brightened, then vanished from the ceiling. A cold, hysterical woman's voice echoed from the hall. It was Mrs. Ashworth, moving backward through the loop. "It's 1:17, John. The grandfather clock is running backward." Jasper saw the spectral image of Mr. John Ashworth appear, terrified, holding a lamp that flickered backward, sucking the flame back toward the wick. Ashworth didn't see Jasper. He was living his final eternal loop. Jasper found himself pushed against the far wall by an invisible, time-reversed current. He watched the event unfold in horrifying rewind. The fire in the hall retreating, the smoke drawing back, the air growing colder as the warmth was drawn out of him, feeding the reversal. The Ashworths' mother, father, and 2 children were trapped. Every minute they spent moving toward their death, the house's 267 clocks would wind them back, forcing them to experience the combustion and panic again. The brass clock, frozen at 1:18 a.m., was the anchor. Jasper reached out, intending to shatter its mechanism and break the cycle. But Mrs. Ashworth's voice, cold and backward, screamed right next to him. "The loop is closing. If you touch the clock, you will be anchored here. You will become part of the wind-up." Jasper recoiled, his hand shaking. He understood. He wouldn't stop the loop. He would only become the new catalyst, eternally trapped with them. The thrumming intensified. He turned and sprinted, running against the flow of reversed time, feeling an immense, sticky resistance. As he plunged down the stairs, the clocks spun wildly, throwing his own actions into a temporary reverse. He burst through the front door. The instant he was outside, the world snapped back into normal forward time. The heat returned, and the frantic ticking of 267 clocks was silenced. Jasper leaned against the railing, knowing that inside the loop had just reset. The Ashworths were back at 1:17 a.m., starting their journey toward a death they could never fully reach. He had escaped the cycle, but he carried the knowledge. Now, every time a clock chimed, he heard that terrible reversed thrumming, knowing a family was perpetually counting down to a moment of doom, trapped forever at the eternal 1:18 a.m.